Sorry about that, folks. Hey, I forgot to unblock my screen here. I hope you're all doing well tonight. Thank you for coming. And hi, Dolores. Thanks for sharing. Hey, Greg. How are you? Hi, Dolores from YouTube. Stephen Wolfbrandt, that is. Hello to you. Greg says, logging in from my phone to do some shares. Thanks, Greg. Start says, shared. Hey, Joe, bring the volcano. Hi, everyone. But Lana says, hi, all. Share to Twitter. Thank you, Lana. And Kay says, shared. Thank you, Kay. Okay, so tonight, I thought it would be good to spend considerable time on exactly what Howie Hawkins' criticisms of Biden's climate plans actually are. And the reason why I wanted to do this is that in the process of criticizing what Biden's climate plan that was put forward, actually, as of last April, we also learned a lot about the details of Howie Hawkins' plan. And we get to see how much more comprehensive it was. So I think that's interesting. We don't have to think that Howie Hawkins was such a good candidate for president, to be able to say whether we like his plan or not, his position when it comes to this issue. And so I think it's important for us to learn about that, since anybody can use his plan. After all, it's out there. And we have to ask, why weren't other people using that plan? Or why shouldn't they use it now? So with that, let's go to Howie's article, which appeared in Counterpunch last April. That is April of 2021. He was no longer running for president. He had been defeated. And this was on April 28th, 2021 from Counterpunch. Biden's climate plan, it's too late for gradualism. My title for this episode, of course, was It's Too Late for Gradualism. I took the title from Howie's title. There's a photograph of, I'm not sure what, I don't see a caption. It looks like a photograph of the parched earth. But President Biden gave us his climate plan on March 31st. It was buried inside his American Jobs Plan. The 12,000-word fact sheet about it, released by the White House, hardly acknowledges the climate emergency. The plan is presented as a jobs through infrastructure program. Howie says further, the climate emergency demands a radical and rapid decarbonization of the economy with numerical goals and timetables to transform all productive sectors, not only power production, which is 20% of carbon emissions, but also transportation, 20%, manufacturing 22%, buildings 12%, and agriculture 10%. That emergency transformation can only be met by an eco-socialist approach using public enterprise and planning, says Howard. So you see the direction he's going already. And what was that, the second paragraph or the third paragraph? Instead, Biden's plan emphasizes corporate welfare, subsidies, and tax incentives for clean energy that will take uncertain effect at a leisurely pace in the markets. Moreover, it does nothing to stop more oil and gas fracking and pipelines for more gas-fired power plants, or to shut down coal-fired power plants. Without directly saying so, it is a plan to burn fossil fuels for decades to come. I think that's a true statement and a true conclusion. And it highlights, puts us face to face with the inadequacy of Biden's climate plan. Because we can't afford to burn fossil fuels for decades to come. I mean, anybody who's living through the heat waves we're having now knows that. How he goes on, the scale of spending falls pathetically short of what is needed to decarbonize the economy. An effective plan would not only reach zero emissions on a fast timeline, it would also move quickly towards negative emissions, drawing carbon out of the atmosphere, because we are already at a carbon level that is triggering dangerous climate change. It's too late for gradualism, says Howard. We must at least aim for the initial target of 350 parts per million. That was proposed 13 years ago by climate scientist James Hansen and colleagues in a 2008 study. Even in that research report, Hansen et al. Concluded that 300 to 325 parts per million, quote, may be needed to restore sea ice to its area of 25 years ago. So he said that in 2008, 25 years before that, of course, was 1983. Other prominent climate scientists at the time, such as John Schellenhuber, director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany, were saying that only a return to pre-industrial level of CO2 of 280 parts per million would guarantee a safe climate. The Earth sailed past that 350 parts per million at the end of 1988 at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, which is an observatory on the Big Island there. Carbon dioxide averaged 414 parts per million in 2020, averaged 418 parts per million in March of this year, and set a record of 421 parts per million on April 3rd. Oh, you may have noticed that I'm back with my wine tonight. I'm happy to report that my tests were normal today, which means that I can go back to 4 ounces of wine per day. So right now I'm having my 1 ounce, at 9 o'clock, which is making me very, very happy right now. The last time atmospheric carbon was this high was in the mid-Pliocene warm period, 3.6 million years ago, when the temperature was 4 degrees Celsius, 7 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter, and sea levels were 24 meters, that is 78 feet, higher than today. At last year's 2.6 parts per million annual rate of carbon dioxide rise, the planet will hit 500 parts per million around 2050. The last time carbon dioxide levels were at 500 parts per million was in the middle Miocene, 16 million years ago, when temperatures were as much as 8 degrees Celsius, 14 degrees Fahrenheit higher, and sea levels were 40 meters, 130 feet higher. These climate changes are locked into the climate system by the contemporary carbon emissions, unless the world not only zeroes out emissions, but soon gets to negative emissions by drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and into the biosphere by reforestation, by building carbon-rich living soils with regenerative agriculture. Are you listening, Ed Markey and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? No net zero for Howie. Not even net zero. Not even carbon zero. But getting to negative emissions by drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and into the biosphere by reforestation and by rebuilding carbon-rich living soils with regenerative agriculture. Today's rapid climate change entails more than the heat waves, extreme weather, and flooded cities in the headlines. Between now and 2050, we face mass extinctions, collapsing land and ocean ecosystems, agricultural crises, and food shortages, economic contraction, and increasing poverty. Hundreds of millions of climate refugees, and escalating social conflicts and resource wars. The U.S. National Intelligence Council takes projections seriously in its March 2021 Global Trends 2040 report. In one of its scenarios, in the early 2030s, a global food catastrophe caused by climate events and environmental degradation, unquote, prompts bottom-up revolutionary change, quote unquote, where Green parties sweep in European elections in 2034 and 2036, and later in the US, Canada, and Australia. The Western Greens are joined by a China that is suffering famine and social unrest due to depleted fisheries and depressed harvests around the globe. They lead a redistributive restructuring of the global economy to combat global warming, environmental degradation, and poverty. The petrostates in Russia and the Persian Gulf resist, but face their own disruptive domestic political movements. We shouldn't have to wait for mass starvation a decade from now to instigate an emergency response to climate change. It may still be possible, according to one aggressive and optimistic scenario proposed by James Hansen, to avert climate calamity. Hansen's scenario is based on a rapid phase out of emissions coupled to a radical transformation of agriculture and forestry in order to draw down atmospheric carbon to below 350 parts per million by the end of the century. This drawdown scenario is based on maximizing the global potential for soil and forest the restoration to absorb atmospheric carbon. The hope in this scenario is that the 350 parts per million safety zone will be restored in time to avert tipping points, by that initiate self-reinforcing climate crisis processes that could make catastrophic global warming irreversible. We are nowhere near the kind of emergency response to climate crisis that Hansen proposed. 2018 special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius by the IPCC projected that to have a 67% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the remaining global carbon budget was 420 gigatons of CO2. Today, that carbon budget is down to 280 gigatons of CO2. If the burn rate continues at its current 42 gigatons per year, we will blow through the budget by the end of 2027. Howie says, a 67% chance is like playing Russian roulette and pulling the trigger of a 6-chamber revolver with bullets in 2 of the chambers. Those are not the odds we would choose, but it is the best chance that climate scientists tell us we have if we immediately begin an emergency transformation of our energy system. Unfortunately, Biden's climate plan is not an emergency plan. Much of the Biden plan's investment budget is for needed improvements to physical infrastructure that does not directly affect carbon emissions, such as roads, bridges, and water systems, or can reduce emissions if it is built for energy efficiency and clean power, such as housing, schools, hospitals, and the broadband needed for an efficiency and renewables-friendly smart grid. The White House fact sheet also outlines many social policies, including directing 40% of infrastructure funds to disadvantaged communities, $5 billion in grants to end exclusionary zoning, promoting union jobs and unions themselves by adopting the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, PRO-Act, and $400 billion for much-needed services for disabled people and seniors. In addition to the American Jobs Plan, Biden is expected to release in the coming weeks an American Family Plan for human infrastructure that will commit another $1 trillion to $2 trillion to child care and pre-K, tuition-free community college, paid leave, child tax credits, and increased Obamacare subsidies to purchase private health insurance. All these social policies move in a progressive direction, although that is debatable for the Obama subsidies instead of Medicare for all. The final details of Biden's plan will be pounded out over the next few months, and the Democrats hope to have Congress vote on the plan in the summer, in a few weeks, folks. To what extent all these physical and care infrastructure proposals survive remains to be seen as corporations lobby and members of Congress horse trade, which will be enhanced with the return of earmarks. I will focus here on the climate impact of Biden's American Jobs Plan. Now it's no longer April 28th, it's July 13th, and we're in the middle of that fight in Congress, and there are all kinds of compromises being vetted, being talked about, being discussed. We have no idea whether anything can be passed. Not even the bipartisan bill that was supposedly agreed upon. There were 10 Republicans that were supposedly in favor of that bill and were going to go forward with it so that it could be passed with 60 votes in the Senate. But already it's reported that 5 of those 10 are not firmly in support of the bill and may not vote for even that bipartisan bill that, of course, is completely unacceptable to many, many Democrats, and that they will only vote for on condition that a reconciliation bill, much broader, gets passed. What the dimensions of that reconciliation bill are, we do not know at this point, but we know that one of the things that people were objecting to was that the bipartisan bill had nothing on the climate in it. It wasn't about the climate emergency, at all. So, with respect to the reconciliation bill itself, we have Bernie saying it's going to be $6 trillion. And we have others saying, no, there's no way we're going to support $6 trillion. And there's a lot of talk about $3 trillion. There's a lot of talk about $4 trillion. There's a lot of talk about $2 trillion. In other words, everybody's all over the place, and we have no idea what people are going to agree to at this point. Part of the reason why we have no idea is that Joe Biden isn't really leading at this point on what should be in this bill. Or maybe we're lucky he's not leading. Perhaps it's best that he just do what everybody seems to be suspicious of, at least on the Republican side. Perhaps he should just turn the whole thing over to Bernie and go home and eat some ice cream. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the next section is called Small Scale. At $2.3 trillion over 8 years, the Biden plan spending is a small fraction of what the climate movement and Green New Dealers have been projecting as needed to address the climate emergency. After subtracting the $400 billion for home and community-based care for the elderly and disabled, only about $1.9 trillion will be spent on developing physical infrastructure that could affect carbon emissions. But it's hard to see how even a quarter of the Biden's plan investments would contribute directly to reducing carbon. Even without considering the cost of building a new clean energy infrastructure, $1.9 trillion is not even enough to cover the 10-year funding gap of $2.6 trillion identified by the American Society for Civil Engineers to maintain an upgrade from its C- rating currently to B quality the country's existing infrastructure. In every sector covered in the White House fact sheet, the investments proposed are insufficient to meet the need. For example, the Biden plan budgets $16 billion to capping hundreds of thousands of orphan oil and gas wells and abandoned mines, quote unquote, that leak greenhouse gases, especially methane, which is 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas in warming the planet over the first 20 years. Actually, there are estimated to be about 5 million of abandoned oil and gas wells and coal mines. The cost of plugging all of them is around $300 billion. And what Howie does not say, but what is obvious from the last paragraph, is that $16 billion doesn't give you enough money to even spit at plugging all those coal mines and gas wells, okay, and oil wells. I mean, it's a spit in the bucket. That's all that is. By comparison, the Thrive, Transform, Heal, and Renew by Investing in a Vibrant Economy agenda, pushed by a Green New Deal network of 15 national progressive organizations, calls for $10 trillion over 10 years. Bernie Sanders proposed $16.3 trillion over 10 years in his campaign's Green New Deal. The eco-socialist Green New Deal budget that I campaigned for running for president as the Green Party candidate, says Howie, was $41.7 trillion over 10 years. That averages, by the way, $4.17 trillion per year for 10 years. Now, that was the kind of scale that was mentioned some years ago now. I think this must go back to 2013 or 2014 by Michael Hexter, a green blogger at the MMT site at neweconomicperspectives.com. And Michael put together a very good Green New Deal plan at the time that was to be funded, of course, in ways consistent with our knowledge of MMT at that time, which is about what it was, very similar to what it is, at this point. But Michael knew about how to finance it, of course. And he was talking in terms of $4 to $6 trillion a year cost for that plan. So Howie's estimate was consistent, with Michael's, and also consistent with what I had been talking about and thinking about for some years. Anyway, to go on with Howie, of that, $27.5 trillion was for a green economy reconstruction program to rebuild all productive systems in the U.S. economy for zero to negative emissions and 100% clean energy by 2030. So Howie is saying zero to negative emissions and 100% clean energy by 2030. Had he been elected president, we would be on the road to that, or perhaps on the road to that if he would have been able to galvanize the Congress when he came in. He would at least be aiming towards that, pitching it, pushing it. What we really need, 100% clean energy by 2030. $14.2 trillion was for an economic bill of rights, including a job guarantee, a guaranteed income above the poverty level. By the way, that is perfectly possible, and there would still be the necessary gap between a job guarantee wage and a guaranteed income above poverty, so that the market rate for labor would be set, the floor for labor would be set by the job guarantee program and not by the guaranteed income program, which is essential if you want your labor market to operate successfully and well at a living wage for people. Also, how he mentions affordable housing for all, also Medicare for all, lifelong tuition-free public education, and a secure retirement for all by doubling Social Security benefits. How many times have I spoken to you about the importance of doubling Social Security benefits over a 3-year period, getting to the level of pension benefits common in the states, of Europe. Next section, the net zero trick. Not only is the scale too small, the plan has no intention of shutting down fossil fuel burning. By failing to halt fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure, the Biden plan locks us into burning fossil fuels for decades. It doesn't even call for the rapid phase out of coal-fired plants, only a third of which are scheduled to be retired by 2035, when Biden's plan projects, quote, net zero, unquote, emissions from the power sector. Biden's plan is a recommitment to the, quote, all of the above, unquote, energy policy of the Obama administration. This approach was underscored the week after the American Jobs Plan was released, when Biden refused to shut down the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline that is operating without a permit while it undergoes a court-ordered environmental review. Well, the Dakota Access Pipeline, as you know, has been abandoned now. That project is going to be shut down. But the Biden administration is now focusing on Line 3 and getting Line 3 done. And of course, there are protests and demonstrations against that as we speak. The trick here is the slippery term, quote, net zero, unquote, which is used interchangeably with the equally misleading, quote, carbon neutrality, unquote. The Biden plan practically assumes the 2035 net zero goal will be met by the deployment of the carbon capture and storage, CCS technology, which is being pushed by big oil as a new profit center. But that won't happen without massive government subsidies. See, that's what this game is about, getting your hands on those government subsidies. The technology is unprofitable because carbon dioxide is nearly worthless, and the massive infrastructure required to pipe it to where underground storage is geologically possible is a huge cost with no revenues. Regardless of the economics, CCS should not be deployed because of its huge environmental risks of water pollution, asphyxiating anyone in close proximity to above-ground leaks, and warming the planet with leaks. Moreover, as Mark Jacobson, an environmental engineer and renewable energy advocate at Stanford, found in a 2019 study of a CCS project, carbon emissions increased because of the fossil fuels that were required to power it. The environmental scientist Barry Commoner warned us in 1990 in Making Peace with the Planet of the folly of pollution control approaches like CCS. He showed that prevention, not control, is the only way to end fossil fuel pollution. In reviewing the first 2 decades of modern federal environmental policy addressing water, air, chemical, and radioactive pollution, Commoner noted that pollution prevention, banning DDT, PCBs, lead in gasoline, and also nuclear bomb tests had worked. Pollution control had not worked. Okay, so prevention had worked, but control had not worked. For example, catalytic converters and power plant scrubbers had not stopped air pollution and acid rain. Most modern pollutants are products of the post-World War II petrochemical industry that substituted synthetic for biological materials. Commoner explained that natural enzymes had co-evolved with biological materials that made them biodegradable and recyclable into the organic biochemistry of life. Synthetic chemicals accumulate to disrupt ecosystems and the health of organisms. Detergents replaced soaps. Plastics replaced paper. Nylon replaced cotton. Pesticides replaced crop rotation, intercropping, and natural pest predators. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizers replaced nitrogen-fixing crops and manure. We have to stop pollution at the point of production by converting to ecological production technologies that don't produce pollutants. Commoner contended that this conversion required governing the economy by public democracy instead of private profit-seeking. When it came to averting what he called the, quote, global warming catastrophe, unquote, Commoner did not propose pollution control in the form of carbon capture and storage by profit-seeking corporations. He proposed a public energy system to completely replace fossil fuels with the efficient use of clean renewables across the world. The program would also replace toxic pollution with the ecologically sound production systems that rely on natural biological materials instead of synthetic petrochemicals. In today's dollars, Commoner's global program would have cost $25 trillion over 25 years. Had we taken his advice, we would have reached a pollution-free economy powered by clean, renewable resources in 2015 and averted the climate and environmental emergency we are now in. His next section is on fiscal conservatism. An effective climate plan would first determine what labor, materials, and new production systems are needed to decarbonize the economy and then figure out how to finance it. Biden's plan does it backwards. It determines what it can spend based on what it can raise in the plan's tax proposals that feature higher corporate tax rates. Instead of this pay-as-you-go fiscal conservatism, the federal government should spend the money now to address the climate emergency and pay for it over time from taxes and in an eco-socialist approach from the sale of publicly produced energy, transportation, housing, and green machinery for pollution-free manufacturing and agriculture. The climate emergency won't wait on a conservative pay-go fiscal policy. That is true, but it also won't wait or shouldn't wait for a policy that addresses the climate emergency now, but pays for it over time from taxes and from the sale of publicly produced energy, transportation, housing, and green machinery for pollution-free manufacturing and agriculture. It doesn't need to be paid for through taxes. It doesn't need to be paid for by selling energy as opposed to giving away energy or selling transportation and housing and green machinery. We can sell some of that if we want to, if it seems important for policy purposes. But of course, these things can all be given away and to pay for can be arrived at by using the powers of government to simply create the currency or create high-value platinum coins to do the financing of the Green New Deal programs. But the bottom line, the climate emergency won't wait on a conservative pay-go fiscal policy. That's absolutely right. So progressive economists calling for infrastructure investment on the Scale to Thrive agenda's 10-year, $10 trillion program say the economy has ample fiscal space to absorb the stimulus without triggering inflation in an economy operating at full capacity. However, we must acknowledge that the massive investments needed to meet the climate challenge have inflationary potential, particularly on the scale of the $41.7 trillion 10-year spending in our eco-socialist Green New Deal. Building up the economy to fully utilize its labor and plant capacity will inevitably produce supply bottlenecks that bid up prices for labor and materials. Economist Stephanie Kelton recently addressed this inflation concern about the large-scale physical and social infrastructure investments that she supports. She suggested a variety of industrial, trade, immigration, healthcare, and tax reforms that could stabilize prices by increasing supply and curtailing demand. If more aggressive measures become necessary to contain inflation, the U.S. could employ price controls and rationing as it did during the high deficit spending of the World War II emergency. Flexible price controls based on tax disincentives rather than direct administrative controls are an option proposed by three radical economists in 1983 in the book Beyond the Wasteland, a Democratic Alternative to Economic Decline. What we cannot afford to do is to let fear of inflation prevent us from making the energy infrastructure investments we need to make now for climate safety, says Howie. Jobs. While the White House fact sheet makes no estimate of the number of jobs the plan would create, Biden said a couple of days after its release that the plan would create 19 million jobs, referring to a report by Moody Analytics. That report actually says there will be 19 million more jobs by 2030 due to the expected post-COVID economic recovery, plus the American Jobs Plan. The net increase due to the American Jobs Plan was 2.7 million. A Georgetown study arguing that the infrastructure stimulus is necessary for full post-COVID recovery attributes a major portion of the employment increase, 15 million jobs, to Biden's infrastructure plan. Further, there's an economic analysis of a $9.5 trillion version of the Thrive agenda that came to 15.5 million jobs. Bernie's $16.3 trillion plan projected 20 million jobs. Our $41.7 trillion eco-socialist Green New Deal budget projected 38 million jobs, including 8.9 million in manufacturing by making an analysis of jobs created per $1 million invested for each sector of production that must be transformed for zero emissions. The monthly unemployment analysis by the National Jobs for All Network for March 21 found the real jobless number to be 22.4 billion compared to the official number of 9.7 million. That seems about right, 22.4 million compared to 9.7 million. Yeah, that's about the right gap between the estimates for U3 unemployment and the actual number, of unemployed. 22 to 9, yes, that's highly believable. The NJ FAN analysis, National Jobs for All Network analysis, includes part-timers who want full-time work, 5.8 million, and discouraged workers, 6.9 million, who want jobs but were not looking and not counted at the time of the monthly government survey. At around 15 million jobs, the Biden and Thrive agenda proposals would not provide jobs for all of the 22.4 million currently unemployed. At 20 million jobs, Sanders' Green New Deal would come close. At 38 million jobs, our eco-socialist Green New Deal faces a labor shortage to complete the program on a fast 10-year timeline. That labor bottleneck is an argument for liberalizing our immigration policy and relieving the world's largest refugee crisis since World War II in order to have the workforce needed to rapidly transform the energy system of the U.S. With far and away the world's largest carbon footprint, what the U.S. does about it in the next decade is crucial to the future habitability of the planet. The United States has the world's largest cumulative carbon emissions by far, 25%, over 400 gigatons of carbon. The U.S. carbon footprint remains the highest per capita and the second highest in total annual carbon emissions after China. Infrastructure jobs are currently 90% male. Social infrastructure investments that create jobs that are filled more by women. Earlier versions of what Biden will call the economic family plan were incorporated into the Thrive Agenda economic analysis, yielding 15.5 million jobs. Sanders' platform presented his care infrastructure proposals separately from his Green New Deal proposal. Our Economic Bill of Rights is part of our eco-socialist Green New Deal. The point is that greater investments in both physical and social infrastructure are needed for full employment for both men and women. Transportation. The biggest investment in Biden's plan affecting carbon emissions is $621 billion over 8 years in the transportation sector, which accounts for 28% of U.S. carbon emissions. By comparison, our budget for the eco-socialist Green New Deal would invest $6.8 trillion, 10 times as much, people, over 10 years in transportation reconstruction. It would electrify all road vehicles and railroad trains, build convenient mass transit across the country, and upgrade the nation's conventional transportation infrastructure, roads, bridges, waterways, ports, aviation, to the specifications recommended by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Fully electrifying transportation would zero out carbon emissions and contribute, along with clean power and manufacturing, to saving around 200,000 lives a year in the United States from premature deaths due to air pollution, even when it is below current the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency air quality standards. The biggest commitment in Biden's transportation budget is $174 billion to electric vehicles, of which $100 billion would be spent on EV customer rebates and $15 billion in grants to leverage private investment to build 500,000 EV charging stations by 2030. In April 2021, UC Berkeley study found that in a scenario where all vehicles sold are electric for cars by 2030 and for trucks by 2035, 8 million public charging stations and 100 million home chargers must be built. As Melissa Lott, an energy policy expert at Columbia University, said to The Guardian, quote, "What Biden has proposed on chargers is a drop in the bucket," unquote. In January, GM in Massachusetts joined California in committing to eliminate the sale of gas and diesel cars, SUVs, and light trucks by 2035. The U.S. Postal Service's 10-year plan, released in March, asked Congress for $8 billion to electrify its 208,000 delivery vehicle fleet by 2035. 2035 deadline corresponds to the 15-year turnover rate for most of the current 250 million cars, SUVs, vans, and pickup trucks on U.S. roads today. In order for almost all vehicles to be electric by 2050, the year when the Biden plan provides economy-wide net zero emissions, the sale of gas and diesel vehicles would have to stop by 2035. Biden has resisted setting a date to end the sale of internal combustion vehicles. Biden's plan says nothing about replacing the U.S. fleet of 3.6 million heavy-duty trucks, 98% of which have diesel engines whose emissions of particulates and other pollutants are especially damaging to health. Replacing diesel with electric power is a public health issue as well as a climate issue. Around half of deaths due to transportation pollution are attributed to diesel exhaust. Trucking accounts for 60% of the ton miles and 85% of the value of freight, even though freight trains use far less fuel. Moving a ton of freight 500 miles per gallon, trains use only 25% of the diesel fuel per ton mile as over-the-road trucks. The $85 billion for public transformation falls far short of the need. New York's Metropolitan Transit Authority alone needs $55 billion in capital improvements over the next 5 years. The plan would invest $80 billion in upgrading railroads, but makes no specific commitments beyond passing references to electrification and to shifting some of the transportation of people and freight from personal vehicles and over-the-road trucking to passenger and freight rails. We already have electric motors powering almost all of our local motors, which are diesel electric. Diesel combustion generates power for the electrical motors. To electrify our rail system is a matter of building the infrastructure to convey electricity to locomotive motors without burning diesel. Our proposal, called Solutionary Rail for electrifying the U.S. rail system, yields an estimated cost of electrifying the nation's 160,000 track miles of $400 billion. Using their per mile estimate, it would cost $1.1 trillion to expand an electrified national rail network to the peak of 430,000 track miles that the nation had in the early 1930s. The rail network expansion would enable the shifting most of the moving of people and freight from roads to rails. Our eco-socialist Grand New Deal budgeted $1 trillion over 10 years to electrify existing rails using a higher cost estimate. The Biden plan also has low ambitions for electrifying the nation's 995,000 diesel buses. The plan's fact sheet says it will replace 50,000 diesel transit vehicles with electric ones, referring to buses, presumably. The electrification of the nation's 480,000 school buses is more ambitious, calling for at least 20% in 8 years, or about 100,000 electric school buses, combining the school and other buses at the pace of 150,000 electric buses in 8 years. It will take over 50 years to electrify the whole 1 million bus fleet. Too late to meet the Biden administration. The Biden plan falls far short in terms of the investments and timelines needed to convert to 100% electric road vehicles, sufficient charging stations, to electrified rail, and to convenient nationwide mass transit if the U.S. transportation sector is going to meet Biden's stated goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. Power. Biden's plan commits to a paltry $100 billion to the electric power sector, which accounts for 27% of U.S. carbon emissions. It is hard to see how these investments, which mostly market incentives in the form of tax credits, could ever result in net zero carbon emissions by 2035, the stated Biden goal for the power sector. Our eco-socialist Green New Deal budget figured it would take $5.1 trillion over 10 years to transform the power production system to zero carbon emissions and 100% clean energy by 2030. Our plan relies on public ownership and planning to make a rapid transformation of power production and distribution based on the need, not the profits of investor-owned companies that will delay investments in clean renewables and a smart grid, at least until their existing power plants and servo-mechanical grids wear out. Our budget includes buying a controlling interest in the energy companies and utilities in order to publicly plan rapid construction of clean, renewable energy sources and the smart grid and energy storage systems that will be needed to deliver reliable power from the distributed and intermittent nature of wind and solar energy. The Biden plan's idea of clean energy includes gas-fired power plants fitted with carbon capture technology, biofuels, and also nuclear power. Besides that, tax credits for clean energy generation. The Biden plan calls for a federal clean energy standard. The CES policy is the alternative that's promoted by corporate energy interests to renewable portfolio standards that 30 states, D.C., Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and U.S. Virgin Islands have adopted. Renewable portfolio standards require utilities to provide increasing proportions of energy over time from clean renewables like solar and wind. The corporate-funded centrist Third Way think tank advocates, quote, a clean energy standard instead of a renewable portfolio standard, which would take advantage of the renewables as well as existing and new nuclear carbon capture and storage, waste to energy and other technologies in its effort to eliminate carbon from the power sector, unquote. Never mind that nuclear carbon capture and storage and burning garbage are far from carbon free. The idea has been kicking around center-right circles in Washington, D.C. for years. Laws for a federal CES. Okay, a law was introduced by Lindsey Graham in 2010 and Jeff Bingaman in 2012. Members of Congress not known as climate champions, but for their fealty to big nukes, oil, gas, and coal. The White House fact sheet states that the CES would leverage the carbon pollution-free energy provided by existing sources, like the nuclear source. In touting Biden's plan, his climate advisor, Gina McCarthy, confirmed that the CES would be inclusive of nuclear power and fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. We have already addressed here the folly of CCS, but the administration insists on pursuing this fossil fuel industry favorite. And McCarthy had met with oil and gas executives the week before the release of the plan, perhaps because these so-called, quote, clean, unquote, alternatives to solar wind are more expensive. The Biden's plan also allocates $35 billion to energy technology and research and development, including carbon capture storage, biofuels, and advanced but nuclear, quote unquote. Biofuels are touted as carbon neutral because they presumably recycle carbon already in the biospheric carbon cycle instead of releasing new carbon that was sequestered underground in fossil fuels. But this view doesn't account for the carbon released by the degradation of living soils and the monocultural industrial farming that's required to grow and harvest the biomass crops like corn, switchgrass, and sugarcane. The result of large-scale biofuel production is a net increase in atmospheric carbon. The pesticides required for biomass plantations pollute soil and water ecosystems. Biomass plantations take land away that is needed for food production. Solar panels produce over 100 times as much energy as biofuels per acre and can be placed on non-arable land. While biofuels are not suitable for large-scale production, for burning in internal combustion engines or electric power production, there are small-scale uses that are compatible with sustainable energy and production system, such as capturing methane from landfills and the anaerobic digestion of wastewater, food wastes, and other organic waste. These technologies already exist. They don't need R&D investments from Biden's infrastructure plan. Quote, advanced but nuclear, unquote, is a catch-all phrase for small modular reactors, SMR, and alternative fuels such as thorium. These technologies are so advanced, quote unquote, they have been researched and unsuccessfully developed since the 1940s. SMRs have been economic and technological failures for decades. 50 years of thorium reactor development also failed. A Union of Concerned Scientists study released in March, just prior to the release of Biden's plan, quote, advanced, unquote, isn't always better, unquote, warns that the so-called advanced nuclear designs are not safer, are not more economical, increase risks of nuclear proliferation and terrorism, and still produce radioactive waste that must be isolated for hundreds of thousands of years. Nukes are far from carbon-free. But nuclear is the third highest carbon emitter among power sources after coal and gas-fired power plants. The life cycle emissions of nuclear is 66 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour compared to wind at 9 grams per kilowatt hour and solar at 32 grams per kilowatt hour. So there you have it. It's really amazing to contemplate it. Nuclear costs 2 to 3 times more per megawatt hour than most forms of solar and wind energy today, according to the asset management firm Lazard, which explains why investors have been choosing renewables over risky nuclear investments for years. Nuclear power has never been able to operate without public subsidies like the Price-Anderson Act, which caps the liabilities of the nuclear industry for accidents because private insurance companies won't fully insure them. Given the economic and environmental costs of nuclear power, it is hard to conceive of any reason why the Biden plan promotes it except the influence of the nuclear industry. Biden was the top recipient of campaign contributions from nuclear reactor provider GE. He was the only presidential candidate to receive donations from employees of the Nuclear Energy Institute. The Nuclear Energy Institute PAC also made donations to pro-nuclear Democrat House, including Majority Leader Steny Hoyer and Majority Whip James Clyburn and Paul Tonko and Mike Doyle on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Solar and wind now provide electricity at a lower cost over the lifetimes of generation facilities than all forms of fossil and nuclear fuels, including the cheaper natural gas provided by the fracking boom. The life cycle costs of solar and wind are lower because once their equipment is built and installed, they don't have to continuously pay for fuel because they just harvest free sunlight and wind. The problem of making a rapid transition to renewables under capitalism is that investment-owned utilities, IOUs, have no incentive to shut down operating fossil fuel and nuclear power plants in order to switch to renewables. This capitalist barrier to renewables is why we must socialize the power sector and operate it at cost for public benefit instead of for private profit. Buildings. The Biden plan for the building sector, which accounts for 12% of carbon emissions, allocates $213 billion in tax credits and grants to stimulate the building or retrofitting of 2 million private sector affordable housing units and commercial buildings, including 1 million apartments and 500,000 homes. At this rate of 2 million buildings over 8 years, it would take 480 years to retrofit the 120 buildings in the U.S. The Biden plan calls for $40 billion to improve the infrastructure of public housing. This investment doesn't begin to meet the need. The New York City Housing Authority alone needs $68.5 billion through 2028 to fix problems with lead, mold, vermin, elevators, roofs, and boilers. In the winter of 2013, 80% of New York City Housing Authority residents went for periods without heat. NYCHA is the nation's largest public housing authority with about a fifth of the 950,000 public housing units in the United States. It's 179,000 units and 326 projects are officially home to some 400,000 people, but actually house about 600,000 people because many family and extended family members are not on the leases and officially counted, but stay in these apartments in order to keep their rents down so they can pay for other essential needs. By comparison, the Green New Deal for public housing introduced by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calls for up to $180 billion to retrofit and rehabilitate and decarbonize all public housing units in the United States. Our eco-socialist Green New Deal budget is 10-year, $6.5 trillion plan to make all buildings in the U.S. zero to negative carbon emissions while providing affordable housing for all. It invests $2.5 trillion to build 25 million new units of public housing in order to make affordable, decent housing a realized human right. The U.S. had a shortage of 7.8 million units of affordable housing for very low income, 7.5 million, and homeless, 400,000 households and individuals in 2017, according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition using census data. The U.S. Department of Education reported that 1.5 million school children experienced a period of homelessness in 2017. This public housing would be mixed income in order to reduce race, class, and segregation, with professionals and middle-income working people living in the same developments with low-income people as they do in public housing in many European countries. The plan invests $2 trillion to cover the upfront costs of retrofitting private sector buildings for energy efficiency and heat pumps to replace fossil fuels for heating. The cost of these retrofits will be paid back by building owners and tenants over time from the savings they get from a lower cost of electrified heating and cooking compared to fossil fuels. It also invests $2 trillion in rooftop and community solar and in energy storage to make buildings significant producers of clean energy. Now that's a plan, folks. As we go through here, you can really see that Howie had a plan. Manufacturing accounts for 22% of the U.S. carbon footprint. Biden's plan invests $300 billion in manufacturing, but the emphasis on increasing domestic manufacturing and supply chains. Semiconductors and medical supplies are emphasized. And impacting on carbon emissions, heat pumps and electric vehicles mentioned. The only direct carbon reduction investment without any amount specified is to establish 10 pioneer facilities that demonstrate carbon capture retrofits for large steel, cement, and chemical production facilities, unquote. Our eco-socialist Green New Deal manufacturing program would eliminate carbon emissions, not seek to capture and store them. It would replace carbon-emitting production with carbon-free or carbon-negative production. It would go through all production technologies and substitute clean alternatives for dirty incumbents. It would replace coke ovens with electric arc furnaces for steel production. It would replace Portland cement, which accounts for 8% of the world's carbon footprint due to its use of calcium carbonate, in which the calcium hardens the cement and the carbon evaporates into the atmosphere. Replacements include a number of zero-carbon alternatives using other hardening materials, as well as negative carbon alternatives, including the one that uses bacteria to grow cement bricks, and another that hardens the cement by absorbing and sequestering carbon. While the chemical industry uses 29% of all energy used in manufacturing, there's no reason why it can't be wind and solar instead of fossil fuels that produce the heat and electricity used. Our plans would spend $2 trillion over 10 years building the green machinery for carbon-free and carbon-negative production in all sectors: power, transportation, manufacturing, buildings, and agriculture. In contrast to the Biden's, quote, clean, unquote, energy standard promotion of waste incinerators that emit carbon and other highly toxic chemicals like dioxin, mercury, and lead, our plan would spend $1 trillion over 10 years building a zero-waste, reuse, and recycling industry, because profit-seeking industries want to wear out the carbon-intensive production systems they currently use before they will consider replacement technologies. The eco-socialist Green New Deal would socialize industries where needed in order to speed the transition to clean technologies. The depleted U.S. machine tool industry is a high priority because it is needed to build the green machinery that will be needed for clean production by other industries. Agriculture. The Biden plan doesn't have a plan for agriculture, which accounts for 10% of U.S. carbon emissions and has the potential to make a bigger impact in reducing atmospheric carbon from regenerating carbon-rich soil than from decarbonizing farm production. Excuse me one second. The White House fact sheet claims to be, quote, positioning the U.S. agricultural sector to lead the shift to net zero emissions while providing economic opportunities for farmers, unquote, but offers no policies or investments to make that happen. The one concrete agricultural climate policy that the Biden administration officials have broached didn't make it into the American Jobs Plan. The policy was carbon farming, quote unquote, which would have paid farmers up to $30 billion to adopt regenerative agriculture practices that draw carbon out of the atmosphere and into the soil. Carbon farming can be a major contributor to carbon drawdown if it is incorporated into broader regenerative agriculture practices that integrate the agroecologies of farms into surrounding ecosystems. Without that broader approach, carbon farming could incentivize land clearing and monocultural plantations that reduce biodiversity, reduce the productivity of surrounding ecosystems, and lower the carbon uptake of the surrounding landscape. Our eco-socialist Green New Deal would invest $1 trillion over 10 years to support a transition to 100% regenerative agriculture, since the labor requirements of such agriculture are higher. The plan pays farmers for the additional labor needed to help subsidize the transition. Policies to support by regenerative agriculture include banning corporate agriculture so the farms belong to the actual farmers, and parity pricing of all agricultural commodities to guarantee a living income above the costs of production. The plan includes the production of green agricultural machinery and building regional processing facilities to support the regenerative farms. The Biden plan budgets for $10 billion for civilian climate corps, with the general statement that it will work on conserving our public lands and waters, bolstering community resilience, and advancing environmental justice. Our eco-socialist Green New Deal budgets $2 trillion over 10 years to employ 4 million people to work primarily on the restoration of forest, wetland, grassland, and agricultural ecosystems for carbon drawdown. $100 billion is also invested upgrading national and state park infrastructure to the recommendations of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and $100 million, which is budgeted over the 10 years for hazardous waste sites cleanup, carbon drawdown through natural climate solutions, restoring forest, wetland, grassland, and agricultural ecosystems should be a central priority of any serious climate action plan. About half of the world's original forests have been cut down, fostering the regrowth of natural forests with all their biodiversity and ecosystem benefits, as opposed to planting the monocultural tree plantations would absorb 9 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year over the first 30 years, equal to about 23% of current annual carbon emissions. Scientists have estimated that restoring the world's original forests that have been cut down could draw down 205 gigatons of carbon dioxide when the forests are fully matured, which is about 2/3 of the 300 gigatons of extra carbon that exist in the atmosphere as a result of human activity, primarily from fossil fuel burning, deforestation, soil degradation, and cement making. The study warns, however, that climate change is already reducing the area of land that can be reforested. Even if global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees centigrade, the area available for reforestation could be reduced by a fifth by 2050. The restoration of living soils also has significant carbon drawdown potential. The world's cultivated soils have lost between 50 and 70% of their original carbon stock. More carbon is stored in biomass below ground than above. Scientists estimate there are 2,500 gigatons of carbon dioxide in soil compared to 560 gigatons in plant and animal life above ground. 2020 scientific study estimates that soil carbon represents 25% of the potential of natural climate solutions. It could store 24 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year, of which 40% would come from the protection of existing soil carbon and 60% from rebuilding depleted stocks. I am coming to the end of this. I know it's lengthy. Eco-socialist solutions. I have Bonnie glaring at me over there. Climate activists are making immediate demands on Biden, Congress, and state and local governments. I would add to that sentence. Climate activists are making immediate demands on Biden, Congress, and state and local governments to quit fooling around. They are fighting for a ban on fracking, a halt to new oil and gas pipelines, and an end to building any new fossil fuel infrastructure. If this infrastructure is built, the powerful corporations that build it will expect profits from burning fossil fuels for decades more. We are winning some of these fights, says Howie. The Delaware Basin Water Commission recently banned fracking in their jurisdiction. The state of Michigan stopped expansion of Enbridge Line 6 last year. Biden stopped construction of the Keystone XL pipeline upon taking office. He could also halt by executive order construction on the Dakota Access Pipeline for moving fracked oil from the Bakken Shale field in North Dakota, and Enbridge Line 3 for moving tar sands oil from Alberta. These pipeline fights are going on across the country, from the Mountain Valley Pipeline in the east to the Pacific Connector gas pipeline in the west. The movement is fighting the construction of new gas-fired power plants from coast to coast. Coast to coast, not post to post, coast to coast. Despite Obama, Biden, loan guarantees for new nukes in 2013, the anti-nuclear movement is steadily winning nuke by nuke to shut down the aging and therefore more accident-prone nuclear plants in the United States. Those fights against new fossil fuel infrastructure and nukes are about stopping more harm. We must also keep demanding more investment in clean energy and natural climate solutions. That is what the broad progressive environmental movement is demanding with its 10 trillion, 10-year Thrive agenda. All of us should demand more. But the climate emergency demands more than stopping more damage and more public clean energy investment in what remains a capital economy. It requires system change. Capitalism is structured to grow endlessly without any balance or reciprocity with ecosystems at the foundation of the human economy. Incumbent for-profit industries fight to continue using the energy sources and technologies they now have and profit from. We cannot restore the climate to the safe zone in an economy where capitalism is the dominant mode of production. We need to do what the U.S. did during the World War II emergency, when the federal government took a quarter of the nation's manufacturing capacity in order to turn industry on a dime into the arsenal of democracy, to arm the Allies to defeat Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo. We need to do nothing less through the public sector now to defeat climate change. That is why our eco-socialist Green New Deal focuses on public enterprise and planning to get the clean energy transformation done on the rapid time scale it needs to be done. We need social ownership and democratic administration of the key industries of the economy in order to coordinate the rapid conversion of all productive sectors, 100% clean, renewable energy, and zero and soon negative carbon emissions. We need economic democracy to carry through the transition. We need eco-socialist solutions now. Wasn't that a terrific piece by Howie Hawkins?
Yes.
Wasn't that a terrific piece? Wasn't that a tremendous contrast with the plans of Biden, the Thrive people, and even Bernie Sanders? That was the plan, at least the kind of plan that we absolutely need to get this done. So obviously, I won't have time to go through some of the articles I thought we might cover today, but I thought this one was so important that I'm sure few of you had read it or paid attention to it, that it was lost in just the shuffle, just as Howie's campaign was lost in the shuffle of the struggle against Donald Trump. But it is a shame. It is a shame that this plan did not get implemented. It needed to be implemented. Now, I'm not saying or contending here that Howie would have made a great president, because there are lots of different factors here. Now, even if by some miracle he won, he would probably have been faced with a Congress of Democrats and Republicans hostile to him. So he may not have been able to implement it. Okay. But nevertheless, this is a plan we need, and it's a plan we need now. It's a plan we're going to need next year. It's a plan we're going to need in 2022. It's a plan we're going to need in 2024 in spades and in more detail, and maybe even more ambitious and more radical. And Howie covered every base here, including societal transformation that we are going to need. I see the reactions here from you. Some of the reactions are very, very good. I'm going to go over them. I notice all of you have not stuck with me today. You probably got tired of the reading. I understand that. That's the way things are. But anyway, I'm going to consider your comments now, and I will come back to I'll come back to the finale when we get done, because it's quite a good finale, I think. So Greg says you all turn on those live notifications so you all can come here once the doc is in, folks. And Gregory says BRB, going out for a smoke. But Evelina says shared. Kay says, hi, Evelina, glad to see you, honey. Evelina says, might be a minor point, but we won't be able to go outside. Evelyn says, hi, love. And Ghost Star says, awa, ding, dang, Lana Rama, bing, bong, and hello, Dolly. And Evelyn says, enjoy, Dr. Joe. And Kay says, shared from YouTube, too. Thank you, Kay. And Lana Dell says, Steve is also obviously drinking, laugh out loud. Glad your test came back okay. Thank you, Lana. Yep, they were all in range today, all in the normal range. That was really amazing because some of them went way out there in reaction to this drug. Kay says, glad to hear that, Joe. Thank you, Kay. Steve says, you need more wine, Doc. I can't have more wine. I got to stick to my budget. My budget is 3 ounces at dinner and 1 ounce, at 9 p.m. That is a budget that I adhere to because I know too much alcohol is not good for me anyway. I have very, very good discipline. I make a budget. I keep to the budget. Evelyn says, the thing about trees is that they're burning. I know. Kay says, it's been a stormy day here in Ohio again today. Kay says, there isn't anywhere to go to get away from it anymore. Ghost Start says, that's my cue. Okay, the mansion says, Dems need to pay for their multi-trillion-dollar spending plans. I'd like to pay for all of it. I don't think we need more debt. My answer to Mansion is, don't worry. We can pay for all the multi-trillion-dollar spending plans, and we don't have to issue any more debt. All we have to do is use platinum coin seniorage or overt congressional financing. Either one will take care of paying for things. I know you think that paying for things means taxing, but that is not necessary, Joe Manchin. If you had a brain in your head, you would know that by now. If you read something every once in a while, you would know that by now. Kay says, Evelina, all those fires in California and other places out west are adding to the problem too. Evelina says, resource wars. Imagine the water wars, which have already started. No secret, much of the water is already contaminated and scarce in some parts of the world, yes. Kay says, I thought having to move back to Ohio would at least give me decent summers. Not. Kay, there's one area which you might, I don't know if you should consider moving to. It's probably still pretty cold up there. But I have a friend who a few years ago, actually it was some years ago now, she originally came from Ironwood, Michigan. And she had studied various things, and she thought global warming was going to make things more tolerable in the winter up, in Ironwood, Michigan. And she was able to go there, to go back there, and to buy a very large house with stained glass windows for something like $25,000. Then she put in another $15,000 or $20,000 to renovate it. And voila, she went back to her hometown and had a magnificent place to live. And she's got family up there. So now she has family around her. She's bringing more family back and getting them all set up. And they're setting up some art colonies up there. And it all sounds like, it's wonderful. And I bet up there, those summers are probably pretty decent, in Ironwood, Michigan. It's a very low-cost area, in the United States. I guess the only problem is they're probably burning fossil fuels for heat still, right? Lana says, Joe Manchin wants to know how we're going to pay for it. Can I scream now? Yeah, you can scream. You can scream. And by the way, if you want to sway Joe Manchin, don't tell him we already paid for it. We did already pay for it with the existing money We always pay for it first. I mean, we always pay for it first. But I think somehow he doesn't want to hear that we already paid for it. I think he wants to know how that extra money is going to get into the Treasury spending account to spend congressional appropriations. He wants to know the mechanics of that. And he's not going to take the explanation, well, we already paid for it previously. The federal government always pays first. No, he's never going to understand that. It's going to go round and round in his head, and he's not going to accept that as congressional financing, the Fed simply creating the money and putting it into the Treasury spending account. But if you tell him that it's not only going to put in the money for the spending, it's also going to put in the money to pay back the debt completely as time goes on, you might be able to convince the guy then. Or if you talk about how the $1 trillion coin is going to pay, or the $100 trillion coin, okay, is going to pay for it. I told you what Biden needed to do from the beginning, first day he got into the presidency, was mint the damn $100 trillion coin so they could no longer talk about the debt. If he had done that, imagine, envision, if on January 20th he had gotten that, he'd gotten in, and by January 23rd he had the people up in New York depositing the newly minted $100 trillion platinum coin into the Federal Reserve. And now it's July. It's 6 months since then. And people could look at how much of the debt had been repaid in those 6 months. I don't know how much. I haven't looked up exactly what is scheduled to be repaid. But I bet it would be already $6 or $7 trillion. That since Joe Biden had gotten into the presidency, that the national debt had gone down from $28 trillion to $21 trillion. Do you really think that Joe Manchin would be talking now about how we had to pay for this because we got the debt? I don't think so. I don't think so. You have to imagine what could have been done and what a big mistake it was not to have done it that way. Lana says, yes, Steve, Manchin, ugh. Sorry, I started on a rant. I'll probably rant a lot more before I get through this one. Oh, Bonnie has something for me to rant about. What?
Well, I went online to see if you could convert a gas car to solar. Do you know it's very easy to do? And what if the government decided to help support people doing that? It would change everything. It would mean that the public is now getting involved in converting their cars.
Right, but of course.
To solar.
Right, but of course there would have to be the solar energy to fuel the cars. And there would have to be the infrastructure so people could get the solar energy into the cars, right? Mm-hmm. So all of that would still have to be part of the kind of program that Howie outlined. It would be a part of that particular program.
But you don't see the government asking the public to consider converting their cars.
Well, I don't see that as part of Biden's program, right? I don't see that as part, of Biden's program. But something like that was in Bernie's program. Yeah. Okay. So Gostart says, U.S. Senate Democratic Leader Schumer says, $3.5 trillion deal reached by Senate Budget Committee Democrats for a partisan infrastructure deal. So what happened to Bernie's $6 trillion? What happened to Bernie's $6 trillion? I think he said the other day $3 trillion wasn't going to be enough for him. So what happened? Did he cave already? Or was it that he said 2 trillion wasn't going to be enough for him? Okay, I forget. But I still think he didn't hold out for enough. I mean, the guy never holds out for enough.
He doesn't know how to bargain.
Now, I wouldn't say he doesn't know how to bargain. He follows a particular bargaining strategy. And his bargaining strategy is always that he doesn't hold out for enough. And I know why. There used to be an old saying. It's an old saying by now. Okay. It was current in the 60s, current in the 70s. Okay. It's rather vulgar. So, okay, I'm not going to complete the old saying. All I'll tell you is that it begins with up against the wall. And you can fill in the final 2 words yourself. Okay, the point is that Bernie never wants to shove somebody up against the wall. He doesn't do that. That's not part of his bargaining strategy. What he wants to do is change the overall environment so people tend towards his position and then get something. And the reason why he plays it that way, I think, is because he wants to come back at another time, for example, next year, and have a situation where people aren't holding any grudges against him. Now, that kind of strategy works if you have 10 years. But we don't have 10 years. We don't have 10 years. We got to start now. I don't think that $3.5 trillion deal is going to be enough to start with. I know Bernie will be back next year trying to get some more. I know he's hopeful that the $3.5 trillion, if it passes, will make enough people happy that the Democrats will win in 2022. But I'm not so sure they will. Even if they do good with that, they're still not passing H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, okay, and the Preventing Whatever It Is Act, the new act, to try to stop the people from overturning the votes, okay, of elections. Those 3 bills have to be passed, or one bill that combines the most important features of all those bills have to be passed if there's going to be a next year. In other words, wait till next year. The old Brooklyn Dodger thing isn't going to work. We don't have many next years left, as Howie made clear in his piece. And there's Kay. We have an Ashland oil refinery several miles from here, and you can still smell it some days. Kay says, the first home I owned here back in the 70s was close to the refinery, and some days you couldn't open windows or go outside. Low-income housing back then, of course, Kay says. Now those POS houses are selling for $100,000. Criminal. Those are really low-cost houses these days. And Carmen says, later Gator has finally arrived. Laugh out loud. Hiya, we'll chill for a while. Thank you, Carmen. Carmen, does anyone know how long the $300 per month child allowance will last? Supposedly, that's going to be in the new infrastructure bill, that it's going to be made permanent in the new infrastructure bill. And Carmen says, and the billionaire space cadets just put more tons of carbon emissions into the ecology. Wasn't that wonderful? And Carmen says, tons, correction. Kay says, no more nukes. They built a nuke plant right on Lake Erie, and it's on the northern end of an earthquake fault. That was brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Kay says, low income needs to be owned by the government, not by corporations. I know. Gorstad says Navy removes training document that appeared to conflate socialists with terrorism. Oh, by the way, Marco Rubio was on today conflating Cuban socialism with the terrorism, and not just Cuban socialism, but socialism all over the world. Socialism forever and everywhere. He equated with dictatorship and totalitarianism and with terrorism, and conveniently forgot about Scandinavian and other European countries that are pretty socialist, where everything is just fine for the people who live in them. Of course, the lying SOB forgot about all that. The lying, moronic SOB, I might add. I might add. That guy wanted to be president someday. He should never have been door catcher. I don't know if he was door catcher. Kay says, the low-income apartment I lived in was owned by the Rose Corporation out of New York City. The building was full of bugs, and they didn't upgrade the elevators till they broke and left many in wheelchairs stranded on the first floor, and the fire department had to come in to rescue those people. It was a huge mess. That is one huge mess. The real target of the Space Boys' efforts isn't the small customer base of those rich enough to afford 5- or 6-figure thrill ride tickets. It's the billions of dollars to be spent by the U.S. government. Of course, that's the target. Spent by the U.S. federal government. Go start. Exactly. Amazing piece by Howie. I skipped too quickly. Somebody said amazing piece by Howie. Carmen. He doesn't get enough credit. Bravo, Howie. I thought it was an amazing piece, too. Kay says, yes, we need to hire him for that job. Kay says, when those low-income apartments are remodeled. And Lana says, Carmen agreed. That was power-packed by Howie. Yeah, I'm going to have Howie on soon again if he'll come. And I think this time we're going to go into a more detailed conversation about his specific Green New Deal plan. We touched on it last time, but I didn't want to entirely focus on that. I wanted to focus on his take about what was happening here in the United States. But now I think with this as a preliminary, it's appropriate for all of us to have the conversation with him about his particular climate plan. So Lana says, Carmen says, how does Manchin not know operational monetary policy federal finance? Because he's probably willfully ignored all the MMT stuff out there. Okay, but I'll tell you something else when it comes to the MMT stuff. Okay, and I think that this particular group of people is ready to accept I'm going to say now. The strategy of the MMT people, the people who developed MMT, okay, and who are the most popular MMT writers, their strategy, okay, is to educate concerning the realities of monetary sovereignty today, and to educate in terms of trying to tell people that we can have nice things with the power the government has now, with very little change in how we do things with respect to federal finance. In other words, the basic idea, okay, of the MMT people when they move into the world of policy is, let's have the minimal change when it comes to monetary practices. Specifically, let's get them to get rid of the debt ceiling laws. Let's get them to get rid of pay-go ideas and to recognize that the size of the debt to GDP ratio doesn't matter, and the size of the debt, okay, doesn't matter. Let's try to persuade them of this. So, you won't hear Stephanie Kelton talking about the platinum coin, the $100 trillion platinum coin, even though she was the one who originally used that particular meme. You won't hear her talking about overt congressional financing, though she's perfectly well aware of it, because even though Bill Mitchell did not call it that, he basically formulated ideas like that some years ago. Okay, now Stephanie will say the government creates its own money. The high-powered money, is created by the government. She'll say that all the time. But she never draws out the obvious implications that, given the political terrain that we have now, the thing we must do as number one priority is to get the people at large to recognize that the debt is no problem, and to decouple the deficit, the size of the deficit, from the size of the debt, so people do not worry about the deficit anymore from the standpoint of its size. They can worry about it from the standpoint of whether it's inflationary or not, but its size per se is not something they should be worrying about. So, they never talk about platinum coins. They never talk about overt congressional financing. And so Manchin and other people like that are free to go on with this baloney sausage about the debt, the debt. We got to do something about the debt. It's so large. The proper response to, we got to do something about the debt is, sure, Joe, we'll be happy to do that. We're going to mint the $100 trillion coin. Then you'll never have to worry about the debt again, Joe. And have Biden do that over a couple of days. Then he has the perfect answer to Joe Manchin. Oh, you worried about the debt, Joe? In 6 months, it'll be down by $7 trillion. You don't have to worry about it anymore, Joe. That's the perfect answer. As a practical political answer right now, that's the right answer. Carmen Muniz says, Lana, it was intellectually orgasmic. Really, Carmen? Okay, Lana says, they refuse to learn. Kay says, they never paint the floors in those buildings when they are fixed for new renters. And so whatever is in there is in there. Kay says, they need to paint the floors in those buildings. Scott and I always did when we took care of the Murchison building in Wilmington, North Carolina. Carmen says, yeah, Lana, Manchin, a true Manchurian candidate, so to speak. He's just helping the Republicans and the oligarchs to obstruct. Ghostart says, in April, a subsidiary of Branson's by Virgin Galactic announced it had won a $35 million contract from the Space Force. NASA awarded Musk's SpaceX a $2.9 billion contract to send a man to the moon. Why the hell are they farming that stuff out? Why are they farming that stuff out? That is lemon socialism, pure and simple. It is lemon socialism. We got to start calling it lemon socialism. I mean, the government is perfectly capable of doing that stuff. SpaceX has no greater capability than NASA. what they're doing is they're hollowing out NASA. They're still giving them the same appropriations, but they're causing them to have the private sector spend those appropriations. Of course, the private sector is never more efficient because they take the damn profits. Kay says, great idea, Barney Firestone. Lennon says, that was hilarious, Dr. Joe. You showing how the info would go around and around. And Manchin said, yeah, he'd never be able to see the paradigm. He can't accept that education in his head. He just can't accept Warren Mosler's simple idea that the government spends first. You know that story Warren tells about how he went to Italy and he went to Vesuvius or something like that. Okay, and he toured around there, and the tour guy started talking about how taxes fund things, and Warren starts to question him and say, well, where did the coins come from? And the guy said, taxes. Well, where did the people who paid the taxes get the coins? Finally, Warren blows the guide's mind, and the guy finally realizes, yeah, they did originally come from the government. The government spent first. Maybe what we do is need to kidnap Joe Manchin, and we need to tie him to a chair somewhere, and we need to bring in Warren. And Warren can go round and round and round with Joe Manchin until he understands the damn paradigm. I'm not speaking of Elizabeth Warren now, of course. I'm talking Warren Mosler. Give him the paradigm. Carmen Muniz says, I've read Solar Trap's Carbon too, but it's better than what we have. Lana says, they won't push what Bonnie was talking about because the fossil fuel lobby would frown on that. We got to start really decapitating the fossil fuel lobby. Carmen says, so Bernie is a softie. Bernie doesn't like to back people up against the wall. Carmen says, BA 77's against the wall. I think that's a rap song too. And Ghost Art says, up against the wall, MFers. That's right. Bonnie says, thanks, Kay Clark. That's what the squad needed to do. Oh, this got also onto some things. So KRTD Media had Kit Cabello on the other day from Hardlands Media. Okay, and they asked him about, well, what about the replace Pelosi thing? Okay, and he sort of had the idea, Kit had the idea, well, of course, that would have been the first step in actually forcing the vote. But he didn't reason through that the replace Pelosi movement wasn't about bargaining with Pelosi. It was about getting rid of Pelosi and then bargaining with the possible successors, with a variety of successors, and being able to assess whether one of those successors would actually deal with them and actually go through with the deals they negotiated. In other words, the first force the vote deal was a matter of the Jimmy Dore types and others who followed him wanted the squad to back Pelosi up against the wall and get those commitments from her when she was backed up against the wall. but leave her in the position of power. And I'm saying that's not really a good thing to do, because she'd be mad as hell and she would pay him back in the future. No, the right thing for them to do with her was to remove her from the position and then bargain with other people in a more friendly way. Bargain hard, but bargain in a friendly way. Trying to establish a relationship with the successor that you can use in order to move a whole raft of things through. Anyway, Kay says, we had a repair guy come to our house. Oh, so Bonnie says, thanks, Kay Clark Ryan. And Kay says, we had a repair guy come to our house in southeast of North Carolina that had all his electric tools and solar. Now, so Lana says, it's raining here. Finally, we are having a terrible drought. Congratulations. Carmen says, yeah, Marco Stupido. Yeah. Go start. Marco Rubio has never had a real job. Ghostart says 5561. Ghostart says 69 plus 546. I don't know. Ghostart, I think, is having some wine tonight. Ghostart says Kitty on the keyboard, laugh out loud. And Lana says, I will contribute to the kidnapping of Mansion for this purpose, laugh out loud. Carmen says, yeah, let's clockwork Orange Mansion. It says Carmen Eunice. Lana says, we can have a mansion intervention. Aha. Lana says, we should still replace Pelosi. Exactly. Vacate the chair. Lana says, Steve is a cat man. I knew it, laugh out loud. Carmen says, good one, Lana. Agree. Get rid of the ice cream, not the ice cream baron, the ice cream baroness. She's a baroness. Ghostart says, dog and cat until March. Okay, guys. I've gone through all of your comments. They were very entertaining. Thank you. I tried to be as entertaining in response. I really do think, though, that Biden should be minting the coin. He should have done it long ago. He should do it now. I don't know if he'll ever see this damn video. Of course he won't. But somebody should tell him. Mint the $100 trillion coin. Give a speech to the American people and say, there is no more debt problem. Then go back to bargaining with Joe Manchin and say, Joe, why do we have to pay for this? I already have the money to pay for this program and to pay off the debt. I got it through the $1 trillion coin, the $100 trillion coin. That's the way I got it. So Lana says, okay, good night. Carmen says, very in-depth tonight. Excellent coverage, Joe. And Barney always makes it worth coming. And Ghostart says, now that's entertainment. But I'm never going to tell you, as the lawyers for Rachel Maddow said, okay, I'm never going to say in court that it doesn't matter what I say because this is only entertainment and you can't expect that I'm necessarily telling you the truth. That was the defense in a recent court case against Rachel. She won. And the way she won is that her lawyers went into court and said, people can't expect that she's telling the truth because what she's doing is entertainment. It's not really reportage. Well, this is commentary. And I am trying to do truthful commentary. And if you think I'm lying about anything, you can sue me. And I'm not going to go into court and say, well, that was entertainment, so I didn't have to tell the truth. I am telling the truth as I see it. And you can take that to the bank. Good night, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow night. Thanks for coming. Thanks for sharing.